I will never forget December 14th, 2012. It seemed like any other day. The sun filtered through the winter trees, covered by a layer of snow, and the small community of Newtown, Connecticut, was preparing for the usual morning hustle. At Sandy Hook Elementary School, the hallways were filled with children's laughter, colorful backpacks, and that unmistakable murmur of excitement from kids ready to learn. For many, it was just another day in the life of a quiet town. For others, it would be their last. I was going about my daily routine when horror suddenly broke into our lives. I remember how the news began to appear on TV and on phones, vague at first, then increasingly alarming. A shooting at an elementary school. The details were unclear, but something inside me told me that this wasn't just another incident. It wasn't. What happened at Sandy Hook that day would not only affect the families of the victims, but the entire country and beyond. 20 children. 20 innocents, full of dreams and with their whole lives ahead of them. 6 adults, dedicated to protecting and educating those children, did everything they could to save them. All of them perished in an act of violence so heartbreaking that it left permanent scars on those who survived and on those of us watching from afar, feeling powerless, with a lump in our throats. As the sirens blared and emergency teams arrived, one question began to invade our minds. How is it possible for a tragedy of this magnitude to happen in a place that should be a sanctuary of safety for children? It's hard to understand. That ordinary day, in a peaceful community, turned into a nightmare no one could have anticipated. In the blink of an eye, the lives of dozens of families were changed forever. And as the news spread, we were all left paralyzed, asking ourselves, how did we get here? This is the story of Sandy Hook. A story that shook us, that made us question our society and our priorities. And today, I want to invite you to explore with me the facts, the unknowns, and the lessons this tragedy left behind. That December 14th, 2012, dawned like any other day. The cold winter breeze wrapped around Newtown, but no one could have imagined that the air would soon become heavy and suffocating with the terror about to unfold. I vividly remember how the first reports started trickling through the media. Confusion reigned. An incident at an elementary school in Connecticut. But how serious could it be? At first, there were only vague rumors, an intruder, shots fired, injuries. However, as the minutes passed, the news became far more grim. The word shooting and school echoed with a violence we were not prepared to process. The story that began to unravel was a nightmare. At 9:35 a.m., a 20-year-old man, Lanza, entered Sandy Hook Elementary School heavily armed. Lanza had already begun his gruesome path that morning by murdering his own mother, Nancy Lanza, at their home. She was his first victim. Minutes later, chaos and violence broke out in the most unexpected place, a classroom of young children. He arrived at the school by breaking through one of the glass windows near the entrance. In his hand, he carried an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle. No one had time to react. There were no warning signs, no sounds to signal the horror that was about to occur. In just a few minutes, he entered the classrooms and shot at point-blank range. It was almost impossible to comprehend. Such cruel, ruthless violence unleashed in a place full of innocence. By the time the police arrived, the scene was devastating. Some 20 minutes after the first shots rang out, Lanza had taken his own life. But not before ending the lives of 26 people. 20 of them were children, between 6 and 7 years old. 6 were adults, teachers, and school staff who had done everything in their power to protect the little ones. The accounts that followed were heartbreaking. Teachers who had hidden children in bathrooms and closets, desperately trying to save their lives. Desperate parents, running to the school not knowing if their children were safe or if their worst nightmares had come true. Minutes dragged on endlessly as authorities tried to account for the survivors and victims. When the magnitude of the tragedy was finally understood, the entire country went into shock. 20 young children had been murdered in their classrooms, in a place where their parents believed they would be safe, protected. The reality was unbearable, both for those who were there and for those of us following the events from afar. I remember feeling a deep sense of disbelief. How could someone commit such an atrocious act? What drove Adam Lanza to perpetrate such horror? And beyond that, how could such a tragedy happen in a nation that prides itself on its safety and values? The following hours were filled with questions and an unbearable emptiness. As the names of the victims were revealed and the stories of those little angels and their brave teachers came to light, a cloud of sorrow enveloped not just Newtown but the entire country. That day marked the end of innocence for many. What happened at Sandy Hook forever changed the way we understand safety in our schools, violence in our society, and the fragility of life. But at the same time, it left one question lingering in the air: what could have been done to prevent it? As the news of the Sandy Hook massacre began to spread, the impact was immediate and profound. The images coming from the scene were hard to watch: stone-faced police officers, parents frantically running towards the school, and an entire community plunged into the deepest sorrow. From the very beginning, it was clear that what had happened on December 14th wouldn't just affect the residents of Newtown but would resonate throughout the entire country and beyond. I remember that, as I watched the live broadcasts, an overwhelming sense of emptiness washed over me. It felt as though time had stopped for a moment as we tried to comprehend the unimaginable. How do you process something like this? How does a nation move forward after such a tragedy? The response was a wave of collective grief. Every corner of the country felt the weight of what had happened. Schools across the nation went on high alert. Parents looked at their children with more concern than before, wondering if the place where they dropped them off each morning was still safe. Meanwhile, social media filled with messages of condolence, solidarity, but also anger and frustration. The initial shock gave way to a question that many had asked before: how much longer? That same day, President Barack Obama addressed the nation, visibly shaken. He could barely hold back tears as he spoke, and that deeply affected me. He wasn't just a political leader offering his condolences, he was a father, a human being, shaken to his core by the loss of so many innocent lives. His words echoed sadness, but also an urgent need for action. His speech wasn't just a lament, it was a call to conscience. The grief wasn't limited to words. In the hours and days that followed, support poured in from all directions. In New York, Los Angeles, and small towns and big cities, thousands of people lit candles in honor of the victims. I remember images of nighttime vigils, streets illuminated only by the small flames of those candles, flickering in a sea of darkness. They were more than simple tributes, they were displays of solidarity, a reflection of people's inability to stand idly by in the face of such tragedy. The entire country was in mourning, and each flame represented not just a life lost, but the collective desire to seek answers. But beyond the tears, the vigils, and the words of support, there was a growing undercurrent of outrage. This wasn't the first time the country had experienced such a tragedy. In fact, it had only been a few years since the shooting at Columbine High School, another devastating episode that had shaken the nation. And in that moment, it was impossible not to ask, how had this happened again? The conversation about guns in America was reignited with renewed force. On television, social media, in the streets, the discussions intensified. Some were loudly demanding change in gun control laws, insisting that stricter measures were imperative to prevent these types of tragedies from continuing to occur. Others, however, staunchly defended the right to bear arms, arguing that the problem was deeper and wouldn't be solved simply by restricting access to firearms. I remember feeling torn by this dichotomy. On one hand, the urgency for change was undeniable. How many more lives had to be lost before concrete actions were taken? But on the other hand, it was also clear that the problem was more complex than it seemed on the surface. It wasn't just about guns, it was about a society that seemed to be fracturing at its core. The days that followed were difficult. Every new detail that emerged about the massacre only added more weight to the grief that was already felt. The stories of the children, their lives cut so tragically short, their dreams that would never be fulfilled. The stories of the teachers who, in their final moments, showed unimaginable bravery, shielding their students with their own bodies. The pain became tangible, not just in Newtown, but in every school, every home, every community. The questions remained unanswered. How did Adam Lanza reach that point of extreme violence? What had failed in the system for someone so young to cause so much harm? And most distressing of all, could it happen again? As the country tried to heal from this new wound, mourning mingled with reflection. It wasn't just about honoring the victims, but about finding a way to prevent this from happening again. But amidst all that pain, one thing became clear. The Sandy Hook massacre wasn't just an act of unspeakable violence, it was also a reflection of a society that had, in some way, failed. And that, perhaps, was the most painful lesson of all. Yet, could this collective pain be transformed into real change? Could we, as a society, learn from this tragedy, or would we simply fall back into the same cycle once again? As the investigation progressed, details about the Sandy Hook shooter, Adam Lanza, began to emerge, bringing with them a complex web of questions about how someone like him could commit such a heinous atrocity. The initial image many of us had was of a withdrawn young man, someone cut off from the world, whose name would be added to the list of those who had made history for the darkest reasons. But as more pieces of the puzzle were uncovered, the portrait of Adam Lanza became more complicated, harder to define. It was revealed that Lanza had grown up in an apparently stable family, with a mother who cared for him and did her best to understand him. However, what began to surface from those years was a story of isolation. From a young age, Adam had shown signs of extreme anxiety and socially dysfunctional behaviors. People who knew him described him as an extremely intelligent young man, but one incapable of effectively relating to the world around him. I remember reading testimonies from his former classmates, who described him as the quiet kid at the back of the classroom, someone who always seemed distant, rarely interacted, and preferred to live in his own world. For many, his face was barely recognizable, a figure that faded into the crowd. But that silence hid much more than anyone could have imagined. Over the years, Adam had been diagnosed with various disorders, including Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder that, in his case, exacerbated his inability to connect emotionally with others. However, as the investigation deepened, it became clear that Asperger's was not, in itself, the trigger for his violence. The true catalyst seemed to lie in a combination of psychological, social, and personal factors that, when combined, created a perfect storm. Adam's relationship with his mother, Nancy Lanza, was one of the most unsettling aspects of his story. Nancy was, according to most sources, a dedicated mother who had quit her job to care for her son full-time. But she was also a mother who, in some way, underestimated the darkness growing inside him. Nancy owned an arsenal of guns in her home, and despite her son's obvious issues, allowed him access to them. Adam not only knew about the guns, but according to reports, had received training in their use. It's a terrifying combination, a fragile and disturbed mind, and easy access to instruments of mass destruction. I've often wondered how Nancy could have come to the conclusion that teaching her son to shoot was the right thing to do. Perhaps, in her mind, she was creating a kind of bond with him, an activity they could share. Or maybe, she simply couldn't see what others were beginning to notice, that Adam was slowly falling apart. One of the most disturbing aspects of Adam's life was his obsession with violent video games and his deep isolation from the real world. He spent hours, entire days, locked in his room, immersed in fantasies of violence and destruction. Some speculate that, for Adam, the line between fantasy and reality began to blur, and in his sick mind, the act of killing ceased to be something unthinkable and became a real option. But was this what led him to commit such an atrocity, or was it simply another symptom of a much deeper problem? As the investigation progressed, more details about Adam's mental state in the months leading up to the attack began to emerge. His interactions with his mother became more tense, more erratic. According to reports, Adam began rejecting all contact with the outside world, refusing even to leave his room. Nancy, in a desperate attempt to help him, had tried to seek medical assistance, but it seemed it was already too late. Adam was sinking deeper and deeper into his own abyss of darkness. What impacts me most about his story is the sense of inevitability. It seemed that every step in Adam's life brought him closer and closer to that fateful day. His mother's attempts to help him, though well-intentioned, failed. The education system, unable to handle his disorder, isolated him even further. And the mental health system, already overwhelmed and underfunded, couldn't intervene in time. The Sandy Hook tragedy was not just the result of one individual's violence, but of a series of systemic failures that allowed that violence to unfold. As I sat reflecting on Adam Lanza's profile, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, it was impossible not to feel deep anger over what he had done. He took innocent lives, broke families, and left scars that will never heal. But on the other hand, I also felt profound sadness. Adam was, in many ways, a victim of his own mind and of a system that didn't know how to help him. Adam Lanza's case is a chilling reminder of how vulnerable our society can be when untreated mental health issues are combined with easy access to firearms. But it is also a story about human fragility. Adam wasn't born a killer. His life was marked by a progressive deterioration that, if properly addressed, might have taken a different course. In the end, what remains is a mix of horror and compassion. Horror for the actions he committed, and compassion for the broken individual who, in some way, was left behind by those meant to protect him. But how do we reconcile those two feelings? How do we understand the pain he caused while recognizing his own internal suffering? Adam Lanza's profile is, ultimately, one of the most complex and tragic in the history of mass violence. And while we can never justify what he did, perhaps we can learn from his story so that something like this never happens again. As we analyze the Sandy Hook tragedy, it becomes inevitable to ask how someone like Adam Lanza was able to access the weapons he used to perpetrate such a devastating massacre. At that moment, I was confronted with an uncomfortable truth: our system, designed to protect us, had failed. The availability of guns in the United States, particularly assault weapons, was not only a factor in the Sandy Hook tragedy but also a deeply ingrained issue in the culture and politics of our country. It is difficult to understand how a young man with evident mental health issues, who lived practically isolated in his own world, could access an arsenal. And yet, that is precisely what happened. The weapons used in the attack were not just any guns, but high-powered ones, designed not just for self-defense or hunting, but to inflict maximum damage in the shortest time possible. Adam Lanza used a Bushmaster XM15E2S, a semi-automatic rifle that had been legally acquired by his mother. This is where the uncomfortable questions begin, the ones we often evade for fear of their implications. How is it that in a country like ours, where we had already witnessed similar tragedies in Columbine, Virginia Tech, and Aurora, assault weapons remained so easily accessible? What allowed our society to permit a disturbed young man to have access to weapons of mass destruction in his own home? And most importantly, what can we do about it to prevent it from happening again? I feel compelled to reflect on the laws governing the purchase and possession of firearms in the United States. The right to bear arms, enshrined in the Second Amendment of our Constitution, is a deeply polarizing issue. For many, it's a matter of freedom, a guarantee of personal safety. For others, it represents a latent danger, a threat that could arise at any moment, as it did in Sandy Hook. After the massacre, voices were raised demanding change. People were tired, exhausted by the constant news of mass shootings. However, despite the public outcry, change did not come. Why? I found myself facing an alarming truth: gun legislation in the United States is not only inadequate, but it's also obstructed by political and economic interests that seem to value the right to bear arms more than the right to life. The power of the gun lobby, led by the National Rifle Association, NRA, is undeniable. With enormous political and economic influence, they have repeatedly blocked any serious attempts to reform gun laws. After Sandy Hook, one would think that things would have changed, that we had finally reached a turning point. But that wasn't the case. Despite the magnitude of the tragedy, proposals to strengthen background checks or limit the sale of assault weapons were met with fierce opposition. I remember watching the debates in Congress, where the same arguments were repeated over and over: guns don't kill people, people kill people, or we can't punish responsible gun owners for the actions of a few. But how many times have we heard these same justifications after a tragedy? How many times have we allowed the interests of a few to outweigh the well-being of the majority? What baffles me most is the lack of will to implement even the most basic gun control measures. Background checks, for example, are an essential tool to prevent dangerous individuals from accessing firearms. And yet, in many states, these checks remain optional or non-existent in private sales and gun shows. Even laws requiring a mandatory waiting period before purchasing firearms, which would help reduce violent impulses, are ignored in much of the country. As I reflect on this, I can't help but think about the lives that could have been saved if our laws had been stricter. If Adam Lanza's mother hadn't had access to an assault weapon, would Sandy Hook have happened? If there were greater regulation on who can possess a gun, could we have prevented other similar tragedies? The answers are not easy, but what is clear is that the status quo has failed. The number of lives we have lost is unacceptable. What pains me most is that we're not just talking about numbers. We are talking about children, teachers, siblings, friends, people whose lives were violently and senselessly cut short. And as long as political gridlock continues, as long as we allow access to guns to be easier than access to proper mental health care, we will continue to perpetuate this cycle of violence. It's terrifying to think about how many tragedies like Sandy Hook could have been prevented with more sensible laws and stricter regulations. But even more terrifying is the possibility that these tragedies will continue because we choose not to act. The question I ask myself, and that we must all ask ourselves, is, how much more are we willing to endure before something changes? Ultimately, the reflection that remains is that the responsibility to prevent these tragedies does not rest solely on lawmakers, but on all of us as a society. Are we willing to accept the price we pay for such lax access to firearms? Or is it time to reassess our priorities so that future generations don't have to live in fear of a tragedy like Sandy Hook happening again? Years have passed since the tragedy at Sandy Hook, but the impact of that day continues to resonate in our consciousness like a wound that never fully heals. What happened at that elementary school was not just an individual tragedy, it was a collective wake-up call, a jolt that stirred many of us from our lethargy. But the question that has lingered since then is, have we learned anything? I remember, in the days that followed, seeing the families of the victims raise their voices with incredible dignity. Parents, siblings, grandparents who, despite their immeasurable pain, chose to channel their suffering into action. They did not allow their loved ones to be remembered solely for the violence that took them away, but for the change their memory should inspire. This is how an unwavering fight for gun law reform began, a movement that, although it has not seen the success many of us hoped for, has managed to make a just cause visible. From personal experience, I can say that I saw how that tragedy changed the conversation in this country. There were debates, marches, legislative proposals, even the president at the time, Barack Obama, was moved to tears during a speech where he called for stricter measures to control gun access. The legacy of Sandy Hook is not just pain, but the persistence of those who refuse to forget and accept inaction as a response. However, the struggle has not been easy. We face a system where economic and political interests often prevail over human life. But the truth is that, despite the obstacles, the movement for gun control has grown. Thanks to the determination of those affected by Sandy Hook and other acts of violence, more people are aware of the need for change. It is no longer just a political debate, but a social outcry. Sandy Hook, with all its sorrow, reminds us that change is possible. Every small step counts. Every voice raised in memory of those children and educators brings us closer to a future where gun violence is not an unavoidable reality.